Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
The U.S. is in effect subsidizing Israel's healthcare system. They have a great healthcare system, right? Whereas
Yeah,
here, you assassinate CEOs in order to get some attention, and then the response to that is to go after people who are posting social media stuff about Luigi, right? So, I mean, we're actually giving more money to Israel's healthcare system, right? Well, not more, but you know what I mean. It's like it's actually more effective, right? Because you have a national healthcare. So, I mean, the U.S. has spent, I mean, just since October 2023 alone, it's hard to tell because they subsidize this and they appropriate that, but I think it's over 30 billion, I believe, and maybe even more than that. So it's a staggering amount of money. And even, when Trump cut off aid to everybody, the two countries exempt were Israel and Egypt, right?
yeah.
And actually, how much time do you have? Are you kind of
I'm available, Bob.
okay? Well, let's chat a little bit about this then, because I think the fact that Egypt was included in that is important, right? Because Egypt has always been America's like really hardcore ally in the region. But when Trump announced, I don't even want to say announced because this guy is just, I think stuff just pops into his head. But when he said that U.S. wanted to not just own the West Bank, right? Immediately, Saudi and Egypt, and I think Jordan, I think pretty much every country in the region immediately condemned it, right? And I'm kind of curious about their position. I mean, because um, they're in the region, and Palestine was kind of at the center, right, of things like the 1967 to 73 wars, and so you have this rhetorical commitment, right? But really, in reality, you're not seeing that except for maybe Yemen, right? And if you want to talk about that, that's cool too. So, what is kind of the role of the other Arab states? Because we've had, our mutual good friends, Iskander and Nate, on to talk about Iran and Lebanon. Talked to Charlie Glass about Syria. One other thing, and I'm kind of rambling here for a minute, but I thought it was
No?
interesting too, because when Trump made the statement, one thing that was kind of lost in it, because he talked about Iran, but he also said, like, essentially, I've been assured that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. And I think that was lost in all this, which is something that Biden would never say, even, right? So it's this really kind of inane and kind of psychotic policy, but I know that there's a lot there. But what about the other Arab states? How do you think they play into this? And can obviously the people to I mean, because we often talk about the Arab street, right? So and there's a real sense, I think, and you can confirm this, but I've heard it from everybody. We talk to a lot of the same people that in the region there's this intense support for the Palestinian people. The government's not so much.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think you're spot on in that regard, Bob. I mean, the actions of the Arab ruling classes across the region do not in any way represent the political will or the determination of the people on the ground, right? The street and the state have two different voices that are coming out pardon me. The Arab street is unanimously pro-Palestine. I mean, people like Lebanon paid such a heavy, the people of Lebanon have paid such a heavy price for their support for Palestinian people. After Gaza, they paid the highest price in the region for this. And of course, the people of Jordan and Egypt and across. But it does speak volumes, Bob, that countries like Egypt, which served as a bulldozer for the normalization agreements from after Camp David in 1977, to reject outright these population transfers. Now, they rejected them when Biden was quietly bringing it up in October, November, December 2023, but they're much more outright and opposed to it now. Of course, countries like Jordan, for instance, cannot afford to take in Palestinian people for various reasons. One, they are very aware, regardless of, say, the conservatism of the Jordanian monarchy and their brand of Jordanian nationalism and their anti-Palestinianism. They are aware that the state cannot survive with with that many people in it. There's extreme water deficiency in Jordan, and of course, the reason for this is that Israel diverted all the water sources and aquifers in the region to support its settlement expansion projects in parts of the deserts, like in Be'er Saba, which in English we say as Beersheba, and the south of the desert part and the Negev desert, right, to make the desert bloom. But Jordan cannot and Jordan does not want to take in the Palestinian people because they do not want Jordan to be an alternative for Palestine. And conversely, the same for Egypt, right? For all their politics and for all their support and collaboration with Israel over the years. And of course, it was Egypt, and then Jordan was the second state to normalize after the Wadi Araba Accords in 1994. But they're very well aware that, well, first off, they cannot just transfer the Palestine problem onto neighboring states because it absolves the colonial atrocities. Second, they are resolute on the two-state solution, regardless of my positions on the two-state solutions. I'm a one-state for all peoples solution, but this is the politics that we're dealing with today. That we're negotiating for 22% of our lands, and even that we're finding it to be an insurmountable, impossible challenge. And third, that they know that the political and economic costs are going to be way too high for them. They cannot put Palestinians in refugee camps and cordon them off from society. That will create their own major internal political dynamics. Of course, the Palestinian people themselves will refuse to just be absorbed in. They will take their internationally recognized right to resist and to fight for the return for their homeland. Of course, these are enshrined in international law themselves. So, of course, there's that dimension too, that pardon me, that these neighboring Arab states do not want to be involved and have to deal with the crisis of these. And lastly, on a greater level, in that on the Arab scale as a whole, and even on a global scale, is that the idea of eradicating Palestinians from the land is universally unaccepted. It really is. As we mentioned in the beginning of the interview, even the staunchest allies like Germany, the UK, Greece, I mean, Germany, France, the UK, they all were outright opposed to this solution in its entirety. Of course, even the most the most pro-Israel normalizing states like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain were immediately came out with statements saying that they refuse this plan, and they will not accept this. They will not allow for it to happen, and they will not allow for their lands to be used for this. So, of course, it's a combination of their own sovereignty at stake, the political cost being extremely magnanimous, the economic toll that it might place onto them, and the fact that, Palestine does remain, despite all the normalizations and despite the destruction of the progressive anti-colonial Arab state structure that we had in the 50s, 60s, arguably into parts of the 70s, that Palestine is still part of the agenda. And as you can see now, the most conservative of the Arab states and the most influential of them all, Saudi Arabia, at 4 a.m. their time, issued a statement that, pardon me, sorry about that. At 4 a.m., issued a statement saying that they're opposed and they do not accept this in any way, shape, or form. In fact, even they said that they will not normalize until they have a two-state solution with East Jerusalem as Palestine's capital. And that's their condition, Bob. So it's not about materiality anymore. It's not about the money, the bribery, the prospects. It's that these people have a right to their land, and frankly, despite them all being pro-Western oriented, despite them all aligning with the United States and in many cases Israel on a lot of domestic, foreign, and regional issues, the Palestine question does remain one that they're not willing to abandon because their own regimes could be at stake as well. I mean, let me give you an example. I studied Jordan, and Jordan has historically, the Hashemite family have historically been have historically been accused of selling out the Palestine cause, from King Abdullah I, who was actually assassinated for his collaboration with the Zionist state and with the negotiations that took place in 1948 and 1949 over the Green Line. And to that, of course, we know our friend Avi Shleim's collusion across the Jordan is a great source for that. To his grandson, King Hussein, who was the first uh, to uh, to turn his guns onto the Palestinian people and repress the armed resistance struggle inside Jordanian territory, to his current, to, of course, when he normalized, to the continuation today. So, of course, the Jordanian ruling family is very scared for obvious reasons that, Palestine is a key factor in popular Arab society and sentiment. It's a global cause. It really is, and it doesn't get clearer than that. And they do not want to be implicated in any shape or form as being party to this, shall we speak. And of course, Egypt is a different case. I mean, you mentioned that all the aid is frozen across the world except Israel and Egypt. Israel for obvious reasons. For Egypt is because this money is a guarantee to enforce the Camp David agreement, right? What is this money goes directly to Israel, to Egypt's military. And of course, Egypt has been a collaborator in the siege of Gaza for the past 18 years. Their borders have been closed off. They've depopulated the Egyptian side of Rafah. So Rafah, Bob, actually is like, for a Texas audiences, like many states that were colonized, the city of Rafah was split into two, like in the same way that we have El Paso and Juarez being part of one historic community. There's a Rafah in Gaza and there's a Rafah in Egypt. And ever since 2013, the Rafah part of Egypt has been depopulated to create like a militarized zone to prevent any quote unquote smuggling or tunnels or the escape of Palestinians or for people who support the cause to be too close to there. So there are many factors at play. And of course, the Egyptian government has, while the Jordanian monarchy might have a sort of hegemony through its royal absolutism in the country over its population, the same way that, say, Saudi Arabia might. Egypt does not. I mean, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has a very, very precarious and unstable situation in Egyptian society, and they're like, the repression there is so high that we're just waiting for there to be another big upsurge of mobilization against the current regime. So I'm sure this is a reason why they continued their funding, because they know that the military is crucial to enforcing the current regime and keeping it alive for the time being.
Now, the exception to this is Yemen, and the American media, when they cover it, doesn't either. Like it kind of condemning Yemen, or they kind of orientalize it, right, with the Houthi rebels or the Houthi pirates, and they kind of free. Why don't you talk a little bit about the reality of what's happening in Yemen, why Yemen is supporting it, and really, I think a really important part is how effective they've been actually,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
we do have this
absolutely.
image of Israel as being almost like omnipotent, right? But as you pointed out earlier, Israel's actually taken a lot of losses, and the Yemenis especially, I think, have been very effective in this in
Yeah,
terms of
yeah.
shipping and shutting down shipping, especially. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely, Bob. I mean, you and I always talk about the need to do an episode on Yemen on its own. I mean,
yeah, we should,
I
we
hope we
will, yeah,
get
we will.
we really do. I mean, for listeners viewing, actually, I'm doing my dissertation on the modern history of Yemen. So I think I'm qualified to speak for a little bit about it. But of course, we do. Let's discuss this component here. Is that ever since the genocide started in Gaza, there have been many states that have been opposing. Taken various means to oppose and to limit Israel's capability of conducting genocide in Gaza. We've seen the diplomatic means by the South American states who have cut off ties with Israel. We've seen those who have come out with the ICC, taken the international legal route through South Africa and Bolivia to prosecute Israel and to get them to halt their extermination of Palestine at the international level, and of course the United Nations route through the Security Council resolutions, which the United States keeps shooting down and vetoing. Now, a country like Yemen came in and said, now Yemen has a historic solidarity with Palestine, like like all of the Arab states, but Yemen more so because they had a deep connection with the Palestinian people. And we can discuss this perhaps in an episode on Yemen, but suffice to say that, actually, like things like their very first labor strike in Yemen's history was actually because in response to the Resolution 181 in December 2nd, 1947. So, which is, of course, the partition of Palestine, the colonization of Palestine. But so the People's Representative Government in Yemen, the Ansar Allah government, who are known derogatorily here in the Western media as the Houthis, mind you, they control 20% of Yemen's land, but 80% of its population. Yemen, of course, has its own tragic history. It's been under warfare and siege and economic strangulations for 9 years itself, and it had come out of it undefeated, actually. So they knew firsthand what the people of Gaza were going through. And of course, solidarity is not by mutuality of suffering. It's actually a much greater greater form of commitment than that. But they were the first to recognize on the scene that, of course, under the Articles of Prevention of Genocide, international states have a duty to prevent genocide. And they decided to take whatever effective means they could, though uh, it might have been limited in its capacity. As I'd mentioned, they'd gone through siege from US-led siege through the Saudis and the UAE for 9 years. They decided that they came to the conclusion that their geographic position, which is on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the point at the southern part of the Red Sea that connects to the Indian Ocean and is a vital conduit for all trade going through the Suez Canal. Around 10% of world's maritime trade passes through that channel. So at its peak, Bob, it's 30 kilometers wide, and at its narrowest, it's 3 kilometers wide. So it's a very, very narrow strait. It's called yeah. Um, yeah, it is. So they decided that, well, the best thing that they can do is impose an economic blockade because they took an actually a very radical position that commerce should go if the world is going to allow the Israeli genocide to continue, that we're going to strangle them economically and we're going to increase the economic costs for them to do so. It started with an operation of Galaxy MK on October 19, 2013, where the Ansar Allah government took their only military helicopter, mind you, the country's only military helicopter and their only aerial military vehicle on a mission and with boats to seize an Israeli-owned commercial shipping line. To seize it, now the helicopter was draped in Palestine flags, and the soldiers were all had keffiyeh straps when they were taking it. It was quite the mission for the eyes, right? So they really catapulted into global headlines. So they did this. They seized the crew. The crew have been released. They released all of the crew members. As soon as the ceasefire agreement came, they were true to their commitment. They had just come out 2 years earlier under the terrorist list that the United States designated them under. Former President Joe Biden removed them from the terror designated list in 2021. But the Yemeni people decided and knew that the sacrifice was greater than all of that. They were willing to risk anything, any gains they had made in the international community to support Palestine. So their blockade for the past 14 months, because they started a little bit later, had been to target it was in phases, Bob. It was to target Israeli-owned ships, then ships going to Israel, then ships with Israeli trade, then the last stage, which they never got to because, of course, they did not want to escalate it this far, was to attack any ship that was passing through the Red Sea passage through Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The United States and 10 imperial powers decided to all create a coalition to address this because for them the free flow of goods reigns supreme over the value they have for human life. So they would much rather see commercial activity be steady and unaffected than let people die, which speaks to the priorities we face under modern capitalist structures. And they had been unsuccessful in being able to quell Yemen's siege on Gaza. And it's actually quite a remarkable siege itself, Bob, because a besieged country itself managed to break free from a siege imposed by the United States and enforced by Saudi and the United Arab Emirates, to then be the ones who lay siege on another country. But their siege is a moral siege, Bob. Their siege is that we're going to make it as difficult as possible as it is for you to conduct genocide. And of course, it impacted global trade. But their mission was that the world only their understanding is that the world only responds to where their pockets hurt. And if it's going to make it more expensive for them, then that will be one way to pressure the genocide. Now, of course, there were many ways that they found workarounds. There was a land corridor that the United Arab Emirates through Jordan into the state of Israel, where goods would travel there. Of course, it made it more expensive. But it definitely did achieve many gains. It destroyed the port of Eilat, which is Rashash. It rendered that port ineffective and bankrupt. Israel's only other port in the occupied city of Haifa in the north became its chief conduit for goods to go. But as you can imagine now, commercial activity had to go all the way through the Cape of Good Hope, through the Mediterranean. Otherwise, if they were coming from the Atlantic, they would have gone through there anyways. But so they made it as difficult for them as possible, and they paid a very heavy price, Bob. And I'm sorry if I'm rambling on trying to give a big picture about it, but the United States bombed Yemen, Britain had bombed Yemen since, Israel had bombed Yemen on four separate occasions. They actually committed international war crimes inside Yemen by bombing their ports. They bombed their infrastructure, an already decimated and crippled infrastructure where the highest levels of hunger and poverty had existed in the 21st century in Yemen, where cholera and malnutrition were on the rise, eradicated diseases like that and polio. So to destroy food depots, to destroy precious oil reserves and depots, they have amount to war crimes, really. But nonetheless, the Yemeni people were steadfast and unwavering in their support. Every single week for the 15 months, you had million-man marches on the streets in Yemen where they were calling for their people to take action, for their government to take action. And now let's look at so-called democratic countries in the West. If a country should be answerable and to the people who put them in power and should follow the calls that their people make. And the Yemeni people had been calling for their government to intervene and to support the people of Palestine, and they took this measure, whether be it right or wrong. Look at in the West, for instance, the people here who go out in the streets, who call on their government to stop funding genocide, to end the war, to force a ceasefire, are met with repression, are met with arrest, are met with blacklisting, are met with supporting terror. So it only speaks to what our perceptions are of representative governments or not. These in Yemen, they've had so much support for their actions. It's come at a price. It really has come at a price, but they understand that their sovereignty is tied to Palestine's sovereignty, and the liberation of the region is inseparable to the liberation of Yemen in that regard. So, and of course, they were true to their word. As soon as the ceasefire ended, they stopped their attacks on Israel. Mind you, Yemen had been sending ballistic missiles into Israel. They had most of them get shot down by Saudi, Egypt, and Jordan, but they still tried to conduct attacks on them. They did multiple drone operations into like occupied Jaffa, which is known as Tel Aviv. They had to go actually 3,000 kilometers off route to avoid getting shot down by Egypt or Saudi Arabia for this. So, and it took a heavy toll. They were redesignated as terrorists again. A lot of people like to claim and tell you that that the Houthis and Ansarullah are doing this for self-aggrandizement and they're doing this for their own personal gain. Well, I'd like to counter that, Bob, and say what gains have they really achieved? They have been redesignated as a terror organization. International coalitions are bombarding them again. They're already depleted infrastructure has been targeted. They're not doing this because it brings them some so-called street cred or makes them more doing it for personal gain. They're doing it because they believe in a just cause. And this is what a lot of commentators unfortunately don't understand is that solidarity isn't a transactional item. You do this for me, I'll do that for you. They do it because they genuinely believe in the liberation of Palestine. And one last thing I'll say, Bob, is that, you know, when may his soul rest in peace, Aaron Bushnell self-emulated outside of the Israeli embassy here, not too far from where I am here. The people in Yemen held banners out in support of Aaron Bushnell. Billboards on the streets of Sana'a to this day exist of Aaron Bushnell. And I'll paraphrase it. It says that, oh, American hero, you will no longer be implicated in this genocide anymore. May your soul rest in peace, you know? So this just shows you that the Yemeni people, they do not hate Americans. They're just opposed to the American government itself and their policies, right? Even as America bombs Yemen, they come out and say, we're not against the American people. We're just opposed to the death of our people at your government's hands. And when the student encampments were being repressed, at the very front of the Million Man March, they held up banners with the students and saying that, oh, brave students, don't back down. You cannot defeat a just cause, or you are. They even offered, I know this is very symbolic, but they offered education, free education in Yemen to all those American students who had been expelled for taking up these encampments and protesting against genocide. So this is the kind of dimension we're working at here in Yemen, and I hope we can have a longer, much more detailed conversation on Yemen itself, because it's one that truly has been neglected and deserves a discussion on its own. Hell, the discussion on their support for Palestine just during the genocide deserves an episode on its own. But yeah, I mean, this is the shorthanded story in this, and even the United States has been trying to bomb has like they've been targeting U.S. naval ships. They're undeterred in this. Of course, now it's stopped since January 19th, but again, it speaks to their discipline and to their unwavering commitment to a cause.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you've studied this kind of stuff like you have and like I have pretty much my whole life, I mean, it's unfortunately a well-known story. I mean, you've seen this happen, but the intensity, of Gaza, which is like 120 square miles or something like that, is really striking. I mean, it really is, reminiscent of an atomic bomb. There are parts of Vietnam which were carpet bombed like this, and kind of the resistance of people. It's an old story of standing up to empire. And the thing about Yemen that I think is really striking is, it'd be much easier for the leaders of Yemen to just go along with the empire. They'd get money, all that kind of stuff like these other states have, and they haven't. Um, Man, there's so much, but one thing I do want to talk about, especially now because you're back in you're in Washington. We're also seeing an attack. We've seen a long-term attack here at home too on people who simply support Palestine, right? So they're called anti-Semitic, and now we have this new law to eliminate 501(c) status. People are hassled. The well-known journalist Ali Abu Nima was detained in, I believe, Switzerland. I forget the name of a scholar from Canada who was not allowed into the U.S. I mean, there's just abundant stories, right, of people who are being attacked or threatened or losing their jobs, and students who are being expelled or suspended. And we saw those ugly scenes last spring where the police came out, sometimes the state police, sometimes private mobs, like at UCLA, sponsored by, I believe, Jerry Seinfeld and his wife, if I'm not mistaken, right? So, I mean, and Trump obviously is, I mean, Biden, I mean, let's face it, the Democrats were all in on that. They started it. They greased the skids. And Trump has promised to continue that, if not even intensify, right? He's talking now about deporting people, sending them to prison in El Salvador, who knows what, right? So as someone now who's in the US, who's working on this issue, long-winded intro, but you're working on this issue, but you also represent, these are your, this is your own background. So it's personal as well, right? Not, I mean, despite the, and it's also just a humanitarian issue for all of us, right? But it's also personal, right? So long-winded place, like what do you see happening now, and how do all of us deal with that, right? It's heightened. Nobody wants to be afraid to speak, and some of us do so with a lot less risk. Like I'm a professor, so who cares what I say, right? But what do you see, and what kind of conversations are going on now about like how to deal with this new and heightened repression? I mean, this is like the Red Scare in the 20s, or something like that.
Yeah, of course, of course. I mean, it's we have to recognize it's a very difficult and challenging times ahead, Bob. But as a U.S. historian, I don't need to tell you this is a continuation of McCarthyism. It's a continuation of late 19th century anti-anarchist laws that were passed. This is part and parcel of America's repression of any form of dissent, political activism, and now it's just targeted towards those who are pro-Palestinian, right? The same sort of tactics were used against communists in the 1950s, as I mentioned, anarchists in the late 19th century, against Vietnam dissenters in the 1960s and 70s, which of course is your specialty. So here I'm talking to the choir, singing to the
Uh,
choir right here.
I've been thinking a lot about Stoughton Lynn, who lost his job at Yale because he went to Vietnam. Yeah.
Yeah, but as you said, this just illustrates it. I mean, we've been facing this in one capacity or another in the United States for a very long time. Of course, it's taken up a very vicious and accelerationist platform now. And yes, we have seen students a student at UCLA had actually been deported after being expelled. Trump is openly talking about deporting so-called pro-Hamas sympathizers on campus. But these boogeymen have long been around, and I'm personally of the opinion that they should not deter us. Now, of course, I have to recognize, and I'm privileged in this capacity as someone with a U.S. citizenship, that it becomes the responsibility of people like you and I who have U.S. citizenship to take up this mantra and to fill in the void where more vulnerable supporters might not be able to assist now. But this is the way I like to think about it, Bob, is that if the worst thing that can be happened to me is to be doxxed, to be put in prison, to be shamed, to get maybe sucker punched on the street, to lose my job, to be shamed, that pales in comparison to what my people are going through back home. Not that I say that it would be nice for it to happen to me, absolutely not. But I mean, like, we're fighting a greater cause, right? And I don't advocate that people should put themselves out on the line in this, but we look in terms of larger structures for human liberation. And the way that I like to approach it, the political tradition where I come from, is the more the more you stay silent, the more you allow yourself to be repressed and to be punished and to allow them to roll over you. So this repression, as we've seen, is happening regardless whether the person in office is wearing a blue or a red tie, whether they're liberal or conservative, whether they're Democrat or Republican. It's part and parcel of American politics. And um, these scare tactics have their effectiveness, but they will not silence a cause. And if I so happen to have to take my cause outside of the United States, then so be it. But again, I don't think that's going to happen. I was born in the United States. They cannot revoke my citizenship for that, right? So,
And they're
um,
trying.
they're trying, try as they might, but we have birthright. So,
Yeah.
what's it called? I mean, but as you and I were both sons of immigrants, and many of the people who are repealing these laws are sons of and children and daughters of people who came here and immigrated. So the repressive, horrific laws that they're trying to do of just the population transfer they're trying to do in Gaza, Bob, is part and parcel of what they're trying to do in the United States of deporting what they claim to be 20 million quote unquote illegal aliens and undocumented people. I mean, these are just absurd claims. And at this point more than ever, Bob, we need to stand and affirm our solidarity. We need to build as big coalitions as we can because these fights are inseparable. The wars that the US are funding at home come at the expense of any sort of good life that Americans can have at home. Every dollar spent abroad is a dollar taken away from improving our liveliness at home. So no amount of legislation can kill causes, no amount of fear tactics. I mean, there have been much worse forms of repression by other governments out there. Of course, I'm not trying to say whitewash what's currently happening, but there have been regimes in history that would take and forcibly disappear people, mutilate them, dissolve them in acid. You know this all too well, right? I mean, the kind of scare tactics that the United States deploy are not as vicious as that regard. So that's my philosophy, at least. I'm not advocating for people to put themselves out or to face any dangers. But at the same time, we know that if we stay silent, they'll just allow us to, they'll allow it will facilitate this even more. I mean, you and I know as people in academia, Bob, you rose through the tenure ladder. A lot of people who are progressive but scared to talk about Palestine say, "Oh, I'm a postdoc now. I'm very worried about my position. Once I get a tenure track job, then I'll speak on Palestine." And when they're in tenure, they say, "Oh, I need to write my book. I need to focus on my research. I need to get good reviews by my chair and by the dean's office so that when I get promoted, then I can speak on Palestine." Okay, so you lost 10 years of your life cowering and hiding away from causes. By 10, 11 years, you really do lose that moral compass yourself. You not only become you don't become complacent in it, but you also lose your attachment to any cause, be it so matter. It just so happens to be that this is the case on Palestine. So in the grand scheme of things, I like to look at it a little bit different. They can come after my job, they can come after my future, but I'm not here for the money. I'm here for my people's right to live and return in their homeland. So that's the way I like to put it. And the last thing I'll say, Bob, is that I feel ashamed, as you and I are members of the University of Houston community, that things like sexual assault that took place on campus, was it yesterday or 2 days ago, in the parking lot? A woman was approached at knife point and sexually assaulted, received received less attention from the UHPD and from the university leadership than did a couple of students who are waving flags trying to set up an encampment outside the library did. They came out in riot shields and with tear gas and with helmets and all of that. But when a woman gets horrifically sexually assaulted on campus at knife point, it just seems to be like an unfortunate event that we have to deal with. Well, why? I mean, you redirect your attention to what's truly needed. And apologies for this diversion, but it's necessary to bring this point up.
Well, last fall we did a read-in or a think-in at the library, just to be very symbolic, you know. And the dean of libraries came there and essentially said, "You're not allowed to think in the library. You're not allowed to read in the library, right? Because
What is the library for then?
right. And I mean, in a very trivial way, I dealt with this over 20 years ago, locally here in Houston. I was on a Pacifica station, allegedly the great lefties, and I called Israel a terrorist state I mean, this was during the second Intifada, and I mean, they came after me, and luckily but to your point, I mean, because they wrote to the dean and the chair of the department, everything, I wasn't concerned, it just, and so, I mean, and we recently saw the American Historical Association, which is just it was a performative thing, I think, to begin with, right? But the members of the HA passed a resolution condemning, Israel, and the executive board reversed it, right? And one of the people on the board, a professor from Oklahoma, I don't recall her name, essentially said, the history isn't settled yet, right?
We
So,
have
and
to
this
wait
is
for
what
the
we're,
dust to clear and the archives to be come out.
yeah, and so I think this is why people get exasperated with folks like you and me and other people on the left, I guess, because this is what liberals do, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult to deal with that. We've been going on a long time, and we do have to talk more, especially about Yemen. But the last thing I kind of want to mention, and if there's anything you want to add, feel free, right? But to kind of get back, like, so today and in still early in February in Gaza, people are returning. Are there going to be food trucks there? Are there reconstruction? Are there are doctors allowed in without being, targeted? Are they going to restore schools? I mean, like I said, from the images, it's just hard to imagine a civil society emerging from that anytime, not just soon, anytime, I don't know, anytime really in a lot of ways, right? So
Yeah.
what's happening today in early February?
Yeah, so in early February, Bob, a lot of food trucks and aid trucks are making their way up to the north. As you can see now that the fighting has stopped. I mean, it's important to note that there's a discussion on its own, but when after October 7th, Hamas retreated as a governing body and said that they're going to operate as resistance forces because we cannot assume the role of functioning as a government and offering services while fighting against this onslaught. But now that the ceasefire has ended, the elements and what's left of Gaza's civil service and their governance structure is being redeployed to a very effective force given how destroyed it is and how depleted they've been over 15 months. So aid has been able to return without the threat of gangs and merchant gangs stealing resources and jacking up prices. And as such, prices have gone down a lot. Why? Because there's a lot of access to supplies and they're not hoarded by like a couple of merchants who collaborate with Israel and to make this kind of artificial shortage crisis that we're facing. Water is the most important aspect that people have been unable to get. The north and the city of Gaza, upwards of 1 million people still don't have access to water. UNRWA now said that 1 million people, UNRWA or UNESCO said that 1 million people now have had access to food and basic aid, which is not enough.
Just let me, I'm assuming the electric and plumbing systems are shattered, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. People those who do have electricity rely on solar panels, or or generators if you're extremely fortunate enough to have a generator, let alone to have oil and fuel to keep it running, right? Of course, people resorted to using cooking oils to do that, but so it's slowly trickling in. Of course, they're holding aid hostage to the they're sorry, my phone was just ringing. They're holding aid and reconstruction hostage over the new agreements that they're trying to build to craft up Netanyahu and Biden together. So they haven't been letting in the necessary amount of supplies in, but they're allowing water and they're allowing resources through primarily through Rafah. But of course, it's not enough, especially given what people are facing now. You know, they need access to trauma centers. They need access to immediate health care. Now they're trickling down. There are tens of thousands of people, Bob, to put it conservatively, who need urgent medical treatment that does not exist in Gaza because of the depleted healthcare system that did not exist prior because of the siege. And Israel has only let out around 100, 203 people out, allowed them to enter Egypt to go do treatment abroad. Mind you, Bob, we're not even talking about people who don't have access to insulin anymore, who can't get their kidneys dilated, who can't get access to their cholesterol medicine, who had to have legs amputated because basic antibiotics could have cured an infection that they had from probably stepping on a nail or shrapnel or something like that. So this is the level of the catastrophe we're facing. And think of the moral dilemma of how were the people, the Gazan Health Ministry were to choose which of these 100 people out of tens of thousands were to go out and need treatment, right? We're talking children with cancer, children who've had shrapnel lodged in their cranium that haven't been able to take out, spinal bullets in spinal cords. I mean, these are very graphic, horrific things, but this is the truth. This is what war is. It's devastating. It's disgusting. Quadruple amputees. We see them in Houston. Houston has been We've received quite a lot of children who came to receive treatment at the Texas Children's Hospital and the TMC Texas Medical Complex because it's the second largest in the world. And so imagine, Bob, a child with one arm who lost two legs and the third arm. Well, what sort of life are they going to live, and how can they rebuild? How can they live a life normally after all of this? So it's very devastating. And but there are lots of mutual aid groups and networks and on the ground boots that are providing hot meals, that are getting water, that are doing as much as possible to bring electricity. We'll put them in the plug. I hope I can give you to put. They're all organizations that I
Sure,
urge people to
sure.
donate to. Not just my own, the one I represent, the Jerusalem Fund, but many others as well, because we give direct aid to groups working on the ground in Gaza through community grassroots funded donations. But projects like the Samir project are bringing water into the north of Gaza. Projects like the Gaza Soup Kitchen are providing meals in the north and have been um, for the past 13 months, maybe 12 and a half months, something like that. There are a lot of ways that people can support and continue. The Gaza educational system, while they destroyed all 12 universities and higher education system, there's a project called the ISNAD project. By the Ta'awun. Ta'awun is formerly the Palestinian Welfare Association. They just rebranded to Arabic as Ta'awun, which means support welfare. They're undergoing a project of sustaining and supporting the Palestinian health educational system by unifying it so that it's a horizontally based distribution of funds. So if you support Ta'awun's Isnad project, you're supporting students getting access to Wi-Fi, to supplies, so that the educators can get paid for teaching classes, so universities can give can continue paying salaries to their staff members. So, despite all the horrors and the suffering that the people have faced, we really do see the genuine, kind-hearted spirit of the people in Palestine and across the world. How our governments might have failed us, but the people themselves will find ways to assist one another, even if it's at this individual level. Of course, I'm a proponent of doing it at the institutional level because as much as I want to and love to support people at the individual level, if you have 300,000 GoFundMe's to assist people, you really do lose the mission of having a unified structure. Of course, part of the problem is that Israel wants to have us disunified, disorganized, which is why they target our institutions and our structures like that. So I advise everyone, of course, we have friends and we have families and fundraisers and people who are trying to individually assist those who are near and dear to them, and we cannot hold them at fault for that. But what I'm hoping is that people can also give to institutions on the ground, Palestinian led, Palestinian supported, that are trying to give the bare minimum and make sure that people's lives return to some semblance of the status quo ante. But that's the problem too. We cannot go to the status quo ante.
Sure.
And of course, I must mention the last thing is that Darwin also have the Noor project, which is the largest orphan welfare fund for Palestinians, because we can only speak to the number of orphans that are going to come out of this genocidal project. So sorry for that.
No, no, no. This has been great, and we have to talk again. I mean, you and I have had discussions that have lasted like all day over this stuff. So, any kind of last thing you want to say? Just kind of something you think is important that we haven't covered, or anything,
Yeah, Bob, I'll leave it at a note that they can test the balloons and test the waters however they may. The the Western imperial powers can openly talk about population transfers and permanent resettlements, but they failed militarily, they failed diplomatically, they failed politically in all of their endeavors. The Palestinian people are here to stay, will not disappear. They've resisted the second Nakba, and we didn't discuss this in the beginning, but the return to the north of Gaza, Bob, is the very first time in history that Palestinians returned to their homeland after being expelled from it. My grandparents and great grandparents were unable to in 1948 when they were forced out. In 1967, the next generation was unable to return. But in 2025, the Palestinian people returned for the first time to their homes in the north. And regardless what they return to, this march of return is the first step of reversing the process of the Nakba, which has been ongoing for 78 years. So I just wanted to make it clear that no amount of hearsay or unbelievable solutions that they come up with, to put it lightly, could deter people or will detach them from the land, because what they don't understand is that the connection to the land is greater than any other kind of material attachment out there. And that's what settler and colonial nations don't understand, is that the people have a dear attachment to their land that's
Yeah.
unwavering and inseparable. As
It's
Jabotinsky said, they cannot be corrupted and are bribed out yet.
That's always striking because, here in America, I mean, if somebody steps in your grass, you shoot them dead. If somebody tries to turn around in your driveway, you shoot them dead. And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
Americans, like, that's my property is sacrosanct to
yeah.
Americans, right? But it's okay when you have like auctions in LA or New York selling land in the West Bank. So,
Exactly, exactly. Private property is supposed to be the most sacrilegious right
right.
in the United States.
Life, liberty, and property. Yeah.
Yeah, but where's their outrage over the private property being obliterated in Gaza? Those are people's homes, apartments, lands. It's part of a greater colonial project, Bob, and unfortunately, it may have taken its toll, but fortunately, the people will always remain.
Yeah. I keep thinking of Anthony Bourdain's comment, nearly everything is made in China except for courage. That's made in Palestine. So, Fadi Kafeety, who is now are you the director? Is that your
Yeah,
title?
the executive director.
Executive director of the Jerusalem Fund. We'll put info in the notes about that. Also, just an absolutely engaged and brilliant scholar of the Middle East. And so it's always good talking to you. This is Bob Bazenko with Green and Red. And check us out. I think it's greenredpodcast.org. Do a Google search on it, right? And we have a bunch of cool stuff. We've done a bunch of stuff on the Middle East, like just in the last 6, 8 months, especially. We've done shows on Iran and Lebanon and and we've talked to journalists, and we've talked to you a couple of times now, and we plan on having more stuff on this. So thank you so much, Fadi, and I'm sure we'll talk again, and keep up the good work, and try to keep your wits about you, because it's a bumpy ride right now. There's a lot of turbulence, and it's getting worse. So
Well, thank you so much for having me, Bob. It's always
thank
a
you.
pleasure.
Thank you.
You are listening to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. Please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. And if you're listening to us on your favorite audio platform, please give us a rate and review. It helps us with the algorithms. And if you really like what you're hearing, please go to our Patreon, patreon.com/greenredpodcast, and become a patron, or make a one-time donation by going to our website at greenandredpodcast.org and hitting that support button.